Yes, Osrith said, as she stood firm. Yes. She made for the door, but Miral stepped inside again, bringing with him a bag. She must keep it. Osrith insisted, but Miral shook his head. You cannot go to Alba without the rest of your wages, Merwal insisted, and you will keep the cloak, he added, for Osrith had folded it up and placed it on the table along with her oak-leaf, the badge of captains of Mercia, and he shook it out for her and draped it over her shoulders. What will your king say if you do not return with enough silver for him? All that is gold does not glitter, Osrith thought, as she curled her hand around the bag. There was value in the intelligence she was giving him, and she knew how valuable that would be to all of Alba. Half an hour, Osrith, Miral repeated, then stepped towards her, and kissed her on the forehead. Osrith turned to follow him, to find a way down where she would not be spotted. But, not before she had laid something beside the oak leaf, the two-headed Alfred shielded coin with a hole that Finan had made to thread onto an arrow chain. On top of the mail shirt and beside the jerkin, she placed it on top of it all. It was no longer their bond, but the bond of herself to Mercia. Why she loved this land, Osrith could never rightly say. She had no kin in it, she did not live there, and had no estate. It wasn't even that it wasn't Wessex, although that still had its advantages. The Saxons in Mercia, and not forgetting the forgotten Angles who lived north of Oxford, were different, somehow, less imperious, more accepting. Osrith was nothing to Mercia, and yet it was everything to her. Anonymous now, just a shawl, watching the square as she made her way down to the upper courtyard level, she watched Miral cross to the stable, which was concealed having been sectioned off by carts. In the middle of the square before the hall a barrel had been placed. A priest was looking at it, and dipping his hand into it so often. A baptism, for her brother, where everyone could see. That was what Elfrith would see. It was conveniently located near a gate which would take her into the section between the palisade wall and the outer walls, and, as she descended, she watched as the nobles of Mercia beginning to collect together, watching as her brother stood before them. He was clothed in white, and beside him stood Pylig, a priest who Osrith liked well, and was, presumably, carrying out the baptism service to make him Christian. Christian on paper, Osrith well knew, for he would merely switch his hammer for his cross when needed. Now she had got to the staircase at the corner of the hall and she descended. The stables were just beyond her, and she would have to sprint quickly and hope that she was ignored. Her brother being bollock naked would distract most of them. As she made to go the light dimmed and in front of her a man stood. It was Edward and, behind him, Miral, pushing himself forward. He looked frantic, as if he had been trying to stop the king. Had he got Grey Shadow? Would she be able to leave now? Osrith made to dart past Edward but he was quicker and blocked her path. Leave us, Edward demanded of Miral, who looked frantically at Osrith. And a thought crossed her mind. Was this a setup? Miral's face said not, and that he was conflicted because he could not oppose the king directly. He was king of a different kingdom, she reminded herself, but it would be no comfort to Miral, who disliked Wessex as much as she did, if he were imprisoned. Play the long game, he had always said, as he had done, but with not much grace, in the Lord Odder's company. He left, and Osrith willed in her mind for him to get Hayard's horse to where they had agreed he would be left, conveniently opposite the western-facing outer gate. Utad is about to be made Lord of Mercia, and you are leaving? He was not the Edward she remembered, and she tried to push past him, but he put an arm out to hold her clothing. Brushing past an unbound breast, Edward looked from it to Osrith. He removed the tie from her hair, and looked at her face, then made to kiss her. Osrith stepped away from him, backing onto wall. I hate my brother. Osrith bit back, thrusting his groping hands from her breasts. They were tender and did not want Edward to be mauling them. He stopped, and took a step backwards, and looked at Osrith as if he hadn't heard her properly. Surely Ethelfled told you? Osrith scorned. She told you much else. Everything snidey, and gossipy, Osrith told herself. Edward shook his head, although Osrith could trust him little. Utad's sister, he mused, then said, and Put her Utad. Gaelish. Edward had spoken Gaelish to her. This time it was Osrith's turn to be shocked. If I am to unite all of the kingdoms, I must speak their languages, Pictish, Cymric, Gaelish, Edward continued, and reached again for her breasts, his eyebrows arching and his lips smirking, his hands feeling around at their largeness, and her huge, tender nipples. And Osrith wondered, as he worked his way down her body, pressing his own frame close to hers, then whether he had deliberately revealed his outrageously ambitious plan to her on purpose, not just King of the Saxons and the Angles, but all of the British lands, Wales and Alba too. Plus Norse and Danish, she said, in Norse, then back into Saxon, because they live here too. Yes, nodded Edward, who was crushing his lips to hers. Wasn't there a coronation on? True, 6 months before, Osrith had been in Wessex to ask for his help against the Norse and Danes, and had willingly gone to his bed. But now? Osrith looked and searched for an answer, but Edward's hands were on her again and he lowered his head to her nipple, sucking on it, through her linen shirt. Come, Edward said, and then she saw her opportunity. Behind them, a door that led to, presumably, the other side of the armory, and it had given her an idea. She let him back her up to the opposing door, and Osrith pulled the bar down behind her. Entirely the right thing to do, because now Edward thought she wanted him to have her, and he looked round for a surface of appropriate height over which to lay her, and maneuvered her over to a table which was at hip height, turning her round so Osrith's back was to him. Then he began to get his hands inside her breeches, which fit all wrong, and he struggled. No. Osrith protested, as one hand, and digits, had pushed down between her cuntlips and found her clitoris, and was trying to get a rhythm going, while the other had reached round for her tit again and rubbing it, the fabric frictioning it uncomfortably as he squeezed it hard. This time, Osrith saw her chance and she ducked under his arm. Never again, she said, holding up her hand, and she rearranged her clothing. Confusion crossed Edward's face, and then he frowned, making for Osrith again. I command, he began, but Osrith was backing herself towards the door that led out, across the square and to freedom. You can command me no longer. Thamio Alba. Thami Scatharch. And she thrust her hand away to knock Edward from his encroachment on her body. She would never have him touch her again, she would never kiss him again. That was not true. As his corpse lay in the cathedral at Cester, 14 years in the future, prayers being said and hopes for the future King of England, whoever he may be, an anonymous warrior stood beside Edward the Elder, and kissed him gently on the lips before she and her son rode south to fight for one of his son's causes. Guards! Called Edward, and guards came, 2 of them, one being that wretched man Aldred. But at the same time, Egelfrith answered the call and saw Osrith standing off before them all. Pushing past her, he stood between them, and Osrith tore past him. Egelfrith followed and Osrith pushed the door closed to the anteroom, and barring it, forcing a plank across 2 steel brackets. A furious hammering erupted behind the door, but Osrith pulled herself together, and looked at Egelfrith. A braver and more quick-witted man I never knew, she told him, as a drum beat ushered in some part of her brother's baptism service. Say you pursued me, get someone to hit you and pretend you tried to stop me, but couldn't. But Egelfrith shook his head. No, he reiterated. I will not pretend. I was nothing but a snivelling mess of a brat before our parents died, Elfkin and I. And you made me what I am, Osrith. He clapped her on the shoulder. Miral said you are leaving, and you are to have a child. Egelfrith glanced at her stomach. I would that you return to Mercia, and lead us once more. I would that, too, Osrith replied, ignoring the protests and bangings on the door, from the 3 men locked within. You will have my brother. She looked out to the square, but could see nothing much, except Tutid clothed in a white robe. He has been chosen to be Lord of Mercia, and I know he will rule it with wisdom. He would be a rival for Edward now, Osrith mused, wryly, if the King of Wessex ever did get out of there. Northumbria with its stains, and Mercia in his hand. Edward may think he has an Ulgans, but he may find he had a rival, bringing the frontier to Eoflic, which was being challenged by the Irish Norse. Then a thought struck Osrith. Can you do something for me? Egelfrith nodded. Anything, he replied. Serve Mercia. Keep only to Mercia, and keep your land distinct from Wessex. For he, Osrith nodded back towards Edward, would subsume and abolish this land we love. And Egelfrith nodded. There was already a good, firm, resistance embedded in the land already. The trick was to not let it grow complacent. I need to make my escape, Osrith said, as she heard the guards barred behind them calling for more guards. Whatever you can do to stop them from stopping me, leave, do it. And with a shake of her former warrior's hand, Osrith shut the outer door to the passageway, before finding stairs that would take her to the upper walkway around the square. From there, she could drop down and be on Grey Shadow before anyone knew any wiser. Across, she climbed, past other mercenaries keen to watch the proceedings. It was not every day that a pagan Danish Saxon was baptized in order to be their lord. It was only after stopping for so long to look herself that Osrith realized she was standing beside a man she knew. And Osrith would never have known, unless Utad's eldest son had not spoken to her. Utad had ripped the name, Utad, from his eldest, replacing it with Judas. What he called himself now, Osrith didn't know. But she still remembered him a quiet, watchful boy. My father, he said, and Osrith turned, shocked. Will it make any difference, aunt? Fourth time lucky? Osrith was so surprised she nearly dropped Buey. I remember you coming to tend my mother. You were at the monastery. I wasn't supposed to have watched, but I did. He looked at her, his blue eyes fixing themselves on hers. I watched, and you eased her suffering. I will never forget your bravery. Utad? And her eldest nephew smiled, wanly. Yes, he acknowledged. Utad, son of Utad, nodding to his father, who was about to get another wash as he used to call baptism, grandson of Utad, brother to two Utrids, nephew to an Utad, cousin to an Utad, he recited, dully, as if he had learned it by rote. Osrith leaned to his ear. Nephew to an Osrith, Osrith told him, and the young man smiled at her, giving a little laugh. I am leaving, she said, before Utad's firstborn asked her to do something, or be involved in something. He was here, presumably, to witness his father's coronation, to ascertain the situation at Cester, where he was bishop. You always are, he replied. Long have I wished to speak to you. Below them, Utad was emerging from the water. Light beamed down through clouds and shone on the square. Some might have said that was a sign. It was certainly not a sign that her brother had instantly become a Christian. Because we are kin, or because we are Christian? He laughed at that. Both. I am called Osbert now. My father took away my right to be called Utad. I know. Osrith nodded. And what would you have me call you? He laughed again. Nephew, he said. Father Osbert, to my flock. You are ordained? He nodded, happily. The see at Cester. Mercia, Osrith added, feeling Buey again. Below them, movement of men, soldiers looking for something. Or someone. She had a good idea who, and hoped that no one had let Edward out. If she were found, he would be cruel, she suspected. Mercia, Osbert replied, close to Maserfield. This time it was Osrith's turn to smile. Oswald, she declared. Our most beloved forefather, Osbert agreed, and Penda. Who never was a Christian, Osrith added, or so Bede told us. Well, she nodded towards the square and to the wooden bath that had been set at the center, at whose steps her brother was now walking, back to see his people. In all his naked glory. Your father is doing what Penda could not. Willingly, this time, she added. If you believe that, Osbert replied. I believe it. God works in mysterious ways, his wonders to perform. It was my mother, the Briton, who must have been the one who insisted on the second time. You see, he cannot take away your right to the name Utad, unless you have been baptized Osbert. Osbert shook his head. A creak made Osrith glance behind Osbert. West Saxon soldiers, coming her way. I would very much like to speak further, nephew, Osrith said, nodding beyond Osbert's shoulder. But again, I am to leave. His face fell, but when he turned, He nodded briefly, to show he understood. If you know me, you know my home is Alba, and I must return for this child's birth. Osbert looked to her stomach, and back to Osrith's face. Aunt, I am delighted for you, please, come to Sester, you are always welcome, both of you. And surprised Osrith by hugging her to him. There was no doubt soldiers were hunting her. Soldiers were in the market square, and roaming through the crowd. In the courtyard, a horse stood, tied with a quick release knot by, presumably, Miral. Grey Shadow was ready. So was she. But Osbert had not finished with her yet. Tell me, Aunt, before you leave, why did you choose Osrith? Your name was once Edra. Can you not guess? She asked. For our family? King Oswy's daughter? She lived amongst the Mersons too, he added. I knew that, Osrith replied, and thank you for reminding me of that. Yes. Oswald's niece. Some say she was of the Irish, the Welsh Church, of St. John and Comesill. As am I, Osrith replied, and we will talk more about this on our next meeting. She grasped his hand, and then turned to look to the post-baptism rituals. They seemed to involve Utad standing at the center of Marketplace with lords in line to greet him. Your father, she told Osbert, becoming a Christian lord. Utad's eldest looked down, watching his father taking hands of people who had been, not very long ago, his enemies. Yes, it is more than I could ever have hoped for him, Aunt, but Osrith was gone. Up, further up, and Osrith was going to climb right over the palisade and down into the stable yard. And she saw, with melting heart, that Egelfrith and Elfkin stood guard by the bar of the gate. Osrith made it across, to the suspended walkway on the other side, strolling across it, as if she was meant to be there, before slid down the steps on the other side. And stopped. Miral was in down the too, and she looked down, back into the marketplace. It was the wrong moment. Her mind was already too full and too troubled as it was. Regardless, she had to make room for the fact that, when Utad moved away to another lord, it gave her a direct view of other people. It gave her a direct view of Finan, with a hand on Edith's shoulder, giving her a look that froze Osrith's heart. But she could not dwell on it. Behind her, West Saxon guards were coming, and it was clear now they were chasing her. They were both ahead and in front. So there was only one option, down. And she did not see Edith point up to the parapet and point out Osrith to an unbelieving Finan, and again, as she dropped down to the dry earth. A guard caught her arm. Osrith struggled, but it did no good, and she was about to bring the hilt of tagged seeks into his face when she heard a voice she knew. Thamoale Nagam, Finan said. You should not be here. But Osrith shook him away. Now? Now was the time he came to talk, after everything? He had all the way across Mercia and back, but no, he chose the last possible moment. I am Merson, it is right that I see the next lord crowned. But Finan ignored her words of reason and displaced them with his own, ones born of deep roots, ones which frost can never kill. I love you, and I still wish to marry you, Osrith, he told her in Gaelish, and looked at her imploringly. Look, we can be together, you can be in Utad's household. Is it so hard to get past what has happened? He is sorry. But Osrith still stood apart from the man she loved, that angry she still was of him. He said so, did he? Finan said nothing. Osrith's attention was caught by Grey Shadow's hoof gently pressing into the dry mud, and she glanced to the gate. Elfkin was giving her a thumbs up. A Blanfear got faithest? He asked. Why? Osrith raged, inwardly. Why did men do this? Will you to fill a U-shaped hole because it was convenient? No. She was not dancing to her brother's tune again, she had tried to come to him on her own terms, and decided if, not if, when, the fight for Bibbenberg resumed again, she would again stand beside Wicca. He is never sorry, Osrith found herself replying. And, if I asked you, could you get past what your family did? There was more than just the slavery. Osrith knew, more happened in Irian that he was always on the brink of telling her, but could never bring himself to. Finan said nothing, but shook his head. At times like this, I wonder what would Comsil do? Osrith said, making a weak attempt at a joke. Finan shrugged. Sail west and set up a monastery in a new land? And then, Finan stiffened, the sound of a drum beating in the courtyard. The coronation is about to begin, he told Osrith. Please, he reached for her hands, and Osrith conceded to let him have them, for once. Wait here, be here when I get back, I beg of you. And he turned, and Osrith watched Finan stride back towards his lord, not waiting for her answer. Intruder. A guard called down from the parapet, and Osrith realized she was still being pursued. One of them screamed as Elfrith clocked another West Saxon on the head, and Osrith stopped in the act of climbing over the palisade wall. Your captain, if you don't mind. Osrith managed, and looked down. Clearly, Miral had managed to get her men here, to help her, and as she got down to a lower level, Oshia had the wherewithal to open the bottom gate as she slid down the steps. He grabbed her hand and helped her up, before watching as Osrith took the handrail, swinging herself around so that she jumped over the culverts that crossed at the bottom of the fortifications and into the stable yard. They turned and fought the West Saxon guards. Beside them, more mercenaries joined them, and not just from her company. Men who Hayad had commanded, others who she recognized only marginally, turned to fight their would-be oppressors. If Edward thought this was going to be a peaceful union, he had another think coming. I saw what happened with Edward, Miral said, as she made it to ground. Above them, an almighty battle was rising. If you are going to leave, now is the right time to go, he added, as he gestured to Grey Shadow, who was patiently kicking his hooves as he dozed in the mid-morning sun. Is he the father? Who? Miral nodded to Finan, who they could see beside Utad, as the new Lord of Mercia continued to thank his people. I have seen the way you look at him. Osrith said nothing, as she noticed Edith's eyes on Finan again, as people came to shake his hand too. He is lost to me, Osrith said, turning away. And I thank you for all you have done. A person cannot buy the friendship I have here, Miral, with you, with Aldhelm, too. She wiped a tear from her face with the back of her hand, and my men, all good, brave, honorable men, I have had a life here I could never have expected. If I do nothing else with my life, I know I gave myself to something I believed in. You? Do nothing else? That I will never believe. And the men are good and brave and honorable because of you, Osrith, you are a good leader, a great one, the men respect you. I would be nothing short of an honor to fight beside you in the future should you stand in the green and gold again. Osrith leaned to him, and clapped him on the back, and Miral returned the gesture, before kissing her forehead. Now, is the time. If you are going, he urged. My guard have just been brought to the front. But, he saw her hesitation. Take a moment, what do you will? Go, Osrith declared, with a finality that she did not feel in her heart. Go, with her daughter, and she felt her stomach, lightly, before clapping her men on the back as they assembled beside Miral, fighting still going on overhead as more and more mercenary guards came to join into who knew what. It was a fight against West Saxons, that was all the excuse they needed. Elfkin made eye contact with Osrith, and she reached for his hand as she passed, squeezing it, remembering taking him as a small child, into her lap and comforting him on night duties, when everyone else was asleep. What a grown man he was now, no fears about him, reliable, stolid, good-humored. She wiped a tear from the corner of her eye and glanced once more to the courtyard, where she saw Finan place a soft hand to Edith's shoulder. This was right, it could only be right. He had found someone less hard work than Osrith, and so she must harden her heart. Down in courtyard, Edith nodded her head and told Finan, it is her, I swear, and added, Marlena's to Reube Midu Gerdenanuate, she said it means I am pleased for the life you have chosen. Like hell it does. Finan shouted, and turned from Utad's warriors. Osrith. Finan called, but it was too late. A figure, on horseback, was heading out of the gates of Aylesbury. Why is she always riding away? He shouted. Beside him, Miral shifted his feet. She said she was going home. he explained, arms folded, and the father of her child was a good-for-nothing bastard. Finan made to swing at him, then stopped, noticing something around Miral's neck. "Where did you get that, you thieving bastard?" "Finan. It was Citric. You are needed." But Finan ignored him, staring at the double-headed king coin, with a hole big enough for a chain he once had. It was now on a leather cord around Miral's neck. "You are the no-good bastard," Miral glowered, leaving her knocked up. "I have now lost a good captain." He glanced down at the coin. "I did not steal it, she left it with her uniform." Finan stared at it, then one glance at Miral, before stalking away. 88,888,888. Utid, clad in green and standing at the front of Aylesbury's Great Hall. He was ready to speak at the Vitton. Lord of Mercia, that was what he had been called for the last day. It was better than Daneslayer, or Ungodly, or Usseling. It would be a short one, his first, and his last. Behind the rude screen, sat his former lover, the future ruler of this land. Her hound, Aldhelm, stood to one side. "She carries my child." Utid turned to Finan, his voice plaintive. Clearly all the excitement of the last 2 days was getting to him. "So she says," he replied, with a grin, as the lords Ludica and Burgard were arranging their factions. To the left sat Edward, with Ethelm to his right. "Your child?" "She probably said so to annoy me, women say that all the time," Utid added, in a tone that made him sound as if he was being reasonable. "It could be his," Utid nodded to Edward. "Found locked in with 2 guards, was the rumor. Was he that way inclined, Utid wondered, or that bastard Constantine could be the father? He saw Finan's face, but continued twisting the emotional life. "It is a story as old as time." "Yours?" Utid scoffed. "What?" Before them, Ludica was holding the Mercen crown, bestudded with emeralds, a sleek coronet. Utid stood just before him, then made to kneel. But Finan pulled him up by the shoulder. "What?" Utid turned a slow, lazy smile on his friend. Finan had already been angry about the fact that he had kept Osrith's identity from him all that time. Well, he had. But he had eyes, didn't he? "She's a spy, like I told you," Utid replied, dismissively, shaking Finan away. "You real are an arsling, you know that." Finan hissed, as he stood beside Utid, who was about to be crowned. His so-called friend looked back up to him, and grinned. "Yes. I know,